So with this, you will understand that the difference between Turiya and Turiyatita with regard to the Samavesha, it is the individual who penetrates into the state of Turiya. You see? It's individual consciousness that experiences penetration into Turiya. But everything higher than Turiya, everything finer than Turiya, it's the other way around. So when it comes to Turiyatita, it is the higher state of consciousness that penetrates individual awareness, and that's where the process of fusion begins. This is the most interesting alchemical churning, where individuality begins to get churned so as to arrive at the to arrive at the product of what this individuality in essence is. An individual is universal. All of you by now, hopefully, have heard about the states of consciousness. And even if in some of the more radical circles, non-dual circles, states of consciousness are refuted or denied on the grounds that there are no states in awareness, there are no states in consciousness, that consciousness is homogeneous. So speaking of the states is inconsistent. At a point of view of awareness, that is correct. Consciousness indeed is homogeneous. But that in itself belongs to a discourse which meant to bring the final synthesis of all that has been already experienced and tie it all together. Therefore, Vedanta as a term, which, as some of you know, comprises the darshanas, the 6 systems of Indian philosophy, the classical 6 systems of Indian philosophy, is more correctly translated as culmination of the Vedas rather than the end of the Vedas. Vedanta. So it's the end of knowledge. Ved, knowledge. Danta means that what comes to an end. So Vedanta as the final 6th system of Indian philosophy, the classically speaking darshanas, is not really the end, but the culmination of all the Vedas, the culmination of the known. And the culmination of the known here is that synthesis and the union of the knower and known. So that's what it means, the end of what Veda stands for. You see? So this is exemplified then in the unfolding discourses by classically breaking down these states of consciousness. 3 of them are known to be relative, and all of us experience these states without exception. Waking, dreaming, deep sleep. Waking, dreaming, deep sleep. They all correspond to brainwave activity, measurable already a long time ago. You can read about this. There's fascinating studies that were made. All this is linked. It was studied scrupulously from various points. Particularly the most interesting studies actually were made, not surprisingly, funded by military complexes, both in the United States and in Soviet Union back in the days, so as to find answers to the optimal functioning of the body, when and how the body can function at the optimum level. And then we have non-relative states of consciousness. In Sanskrit, they are known as Turiya, the fourth, and Turiyatita, beyond the fourth. So, classically speaking, we have 5 states of consciousness, classically speaking, okay? Jagrat, Svapan, Sushupti, Turiya, Turiyatita. This is how they are known in Sanskrit. Waking state of consciousness, obvious. We are now all, hopefully, in a waking state of consciousness, unless someone is dozing or drowsing or napping now. Waking state of consciousness is characterized by acuity of the activity of the mind and the senses. Therefore, we call it waking state of consciousness. Then, the nervous system, which fires at a certain frequency for that state to be possible, mainly, here, in a very simple way to put it, it's the state characterized by the processing of the information provided by the senses and the integration that takes place in order to give us the fullness of that experience of time, space, all the cognitive and perceptual, all the cognitive faculties and all the perceptual abilities. And of course, all this is being overseen by the mind. It is the mind that then interprets the activity of the senses. So waking state of consciousness begins to wane down, nervous system is ready to switch the modus operandi, and then the dreaming state of consciousness comes in. In the dreaming state of consciousness, there are different brainwave activity. The brain, as it were, tired now, processing all that information from the senses. It is not correct to say that the senses tire to provide that. Senses here are as this, let's say, willing participants in the enterprise. And that sensation of the eyes tired, hearing all this, is because the mind cannot process this anymore at a required rate. Of course, if you hear the neuroscientists speaking about it, it will be given a much more refined and precise elaboration. But in a nutshell, that's what it means. You see, senses are instrumentality, right? So when you work with a tool, with an instrument, I'm just giving this clinical example. Of course, it's not as clinical, but this clinical example to illustrate that. If you work with something, with a tool, whatever that tool is, a camera, a lens, a piece of pliers, whatever else you may have there at your disposal, which serves as an instrument. It is not that the instrument gets tired, right? But the one who handles that instrument. The hand gets numb from moving the pliers. The eye gets tired from all this endless focusing and getting the right angle. The camera provides this as long as it's charged. Old-fashioned cameras did not need to be charged. Non-digital cameras did not need to be charged. You know? German-made, functions good, even if made back in the 30s. So that's the instrumentality of the senses. So mind cannot function anymore in that same frequency. So the frequency simply changes. Brainwave activity changes, and that's the dawn of the waking. That's the waning of the waking state of consciousness and rising of the dreaming state of consciousness. So senses, as it were, are withdrawn. They are withdrawn into the mind. So they are withdrawn. This is what the dreaming state of consciousness is characterized. by being withdrawn into the domain of the mind. They don't function. When you're fully asleep and dreams begin to be the subject of entertainment, someone may say something in a room, there may be some incense burning, there may be some sounds outside, even to the sense of touch, which is the most perceptible and the last to be withdrawn. You would not feel it. You would not know it. Senses no longer function. They are withdrawn. And they are withdrawn into the domain of the mind, but the mind is still active. It's just simply fires with different frequency. Then, after a certain time, even that will not suffice. So the mind, and what happens in the senses, by the way, what happens in the waking state, which is very important. This is why the breakthroughs at the beginning of the 20th century were profound in psychoanalysis, in the field of psychology, which opened up the whole new field of inquiry, which is then have been turned into a very useful therapy, dream interpretation. Because one can ask, what's this dream is about? There are also talks about what's more real, waking state or dreaming state of consciousness. From metaphysical point of view, from spiritual point of view, from the point of view of how all this sits together, they are equally important. In fact, it would not be incorrect to conclude that dreaming state of consciousness is just as real as waking state, even though the evidence tells us otherwise. If you ate something in the dream or had some experiences in a dream, upon waking up, this experience fizzled into the thin air. So you didn't have a meal, you didn't kiss the bride, you didn't run a marathon, you were not run by a train or run away from a tiger. But it is still as real in as far as experience is concerned and its impact on your psyche. So therefore, the talks about reality of the waking state and unreality of the dream is inconsistent with the way how things are in the grander scheme of things. I hope this is clear. And this is why psychoanalysis, particularly that the work of Sigmund Freud, which was picked up from, bounced off by Carl Jung, who developed a very, very elaborate system of dream interpretation. You can do your own PhD in that. You can study that and get a PhD in dream interpretation in Carl Jung's, in the system developed by Carl Jung. So, in other words, dreams are the phase of synthesis when information provided by the senses and all that those experiences that we have gone through in the waking state, that's not enough for metabolizing our experiences per se. And whatever is not metabolized in the waking state of consciousness, which corresponds to the conscious state, would have to move to subconscious domain, which is the domain of dreaming state. You see? So this is why answers are given in a dream. Dream can be interpreted in a variety of ways. Dreams can indicate a lot of things that we do not have access in a conscious state, in a waking state. Why? Because that information is not available, not reachable in a conscious state, because it was not metabolized. So it moved into the domain of the subconscious because that's the way nervous system functions. It cannot function having some indigested material in a waking state of consciousness. If we give this example to the digestive system, it's like you cannot eat unless previous meal is fully digested, else it would cause really unpleasant experiences. This example may fall short to full complexity, but it shall suffice in terms of understanding that what we mean by if certain experiences are not metabolized. So therefore, dreaming state of consciousness here fulfills that purpose. Then, another shift, and the shift is into deep sleep, in a state of deep sleep. Deep sleep, known as sushupti, it's the deep sleep state when mind itself is withdrawn. Now, senses are withdrawn into the mind, and now the mind withdrawn into the domain of deep sleep, which corresponds to unconscious or causal. Waking state corresponds to conscious, dreaming state corresponds to subconscious and subtle, and deep sleep corresponds to unconscious and causal. Therefore, we do not experience any content in a deep sleep. Why? Because the mind is idle. There are no instrumentality left. So therefore, for that reason, in tantric yogic tradition, the state of deep sleep, sushupti, is considered to be similar as a cousin of samadhi, because it is the state where mind ceases to function. So deep sleep, therefore, is very important. I gave this analogies many times. Please forgive me. It is a very clinical analogy, because we are not computers. But it's a very, very easy to understand analogy, because we all use computers. When you put your computer on a sleep mode, your laptop after working, that's dreaming state. When you shut down your computer, it's a deep sleep. And any programmist, any computer educated person will tell you that when computer is in a state of sleep, in fact, appropriately it's called sleep mode, computer is still working. It contains and preserves all the information that you've been working on at the moment when you shut that laptop. All of that is remain to be intact. And as soon as you open that, it presents you with all the information and you take it from there. And these very programists and computer engineers, they say periodically you should shut your computer down, because that will prolong the longevity of your computer, your operating system, your hard drive even. Not just operating, not just software, but hardware. Why? Because it will make your computer rest fully. And in doing so, computers are designed in such a way that it checks all the functioning in a system. You know that in another program called Restart. If you want, when you upload it, I'm getting boring now, but please bear with me. It's when you upload it a new app, when you upload it a new operating system, you have to restart your computer. Why? Because it has to reintegrate that back into itself. It's a request, it's a prerequisite, it's a must. Otherwise, malfunction enters the system. So this is the importance of deep sleep. And the duration of this sleep is very short compared to the dreaming. One can have up to 6 hours of dreaming state, but only 20 to 30 minutes of deep sleep, and one will feel refreshed. One can have 8 hours of dreaming state and very little deep sleep, and one will wake up with a headache, and as if one did not sleep at all. One will get up tired. All of you have experienced that. To break someone down in psychological warfare, they implement that very simple procedure. Deprive someone sleep. Not just any sleep, deep sleep. See? Deprive someone deep sleep 3 days in a row, and the nervous system begin to crumble down. So this is just in a nutshell. These are the basics. These are the very, very basics. 3 relative states of consciousness, all corresponding to different brainwave activity, all measurable, and all in response to respective modus operandi. And then comes the 4th, literally. Turiya means that, the 4th. Turiya is known as transcendent. So it's the state of consciousness which is no longer spoken of as relative. And the functioning of the neurophysiology when it's in a state of transcendence, it's altogether different. The brain wave activity, the wave activities are known to have to display extraordinary way of how it is simultaneously displays the aspects that correspond to deep sleep, whilst at the very same time that which is observable in waking state. So this is what Maharishi Mahesh Yogi called the state of meditation with regard to that basic types of meditation. Let's say how he taught that transcendental meditation. It's a state of restful alertness. State of restful alertness. So this 4th state is no longer that what comes and goes. With the 3 aforementioned states, you can see they all rotating frequencies, but they do not have reality of their own. They come and go. So this is the reason why they are not spoken of in terms of having a reality of their own. Whereas transcendent is a state of continuum. It is just experienced as if broken down because the relative states of consciousness take over, take precedent, as it were. So this is the very premise, if you will, spoken in this language, stripping down the 1,000 millennia long tradition devised in the Orient as the highest science, as the science of meditation, that what gives the possibility for the nervous system to get beyond the breaking of one's own consciousness by being fragmented into the 3 relative states. Waking, dreaming, deep sleep, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, waking, dreaming, deep sleep. When that's all we know, our life is fragmented. Our life is broken. In reality, of course, it is never broken. Consciousness is uninterrupted. It never breaks. It's a continuum. But in order to experience that, something needs to happen. And that something here is with regard to making this 4th transcendental state of consciousness one's lived reality. As simple as that. So when one's access to transcendental consciousness is given to the 4th, to the Turiya, then that, as it were, repeatedly replugs ourselves to the source of what empowers 3 relative states of consciousness in the first place, speaking in these terms. So now we will move on to link this with what we've discussed yesterday with regard to the Samaveshas as a triple penetration. And we'll make some important adjustments with regard to whether these Samaveshas are stagily process. So that's with regard to the Turiya, the fourth. Then there is an additional fifth, Turiyatita, literally beyond the fourth, Turiyatita. And beyond the fourth here means it's infinitely more subtle and refined than the preceding state, the state of Turiya. The only difference is that in some traditions, that Turiyatita is further broken down into corresponding three, as it is in Kashmir Shaivism and as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi did, to delineate these states of consciousness. And instead of the 5, we have 7 states of consciousness. You see that? So Turiyatita is then additionally broken into cosmic. I'm speaking with regard to how Maharishi Mahesh Yogi defined it. So the Turiyatita is then further defined as cosmic, God, and unity. Cosmic, God, and unity. So that Turiyatita comprises of the degrees of refinement of the higher states of consciousness, because Turiyatita, obviously, higher than the Turiya. See? So in some books that you will read, in some sources that you will come across, or if you came across already, you will just hear this being addressed as just that, Turiya, Turiyatita. So Turiyatita given that more blanket-like treatment. Whereas as I have mentioned, in some traditions, there is a greater degree of clarity has been introduced so as to further delineate and define these states. So how the Turiyatita here, comprised of the 3 composites, differs. Cosmic state of consciousness corresponds to the witnessing state, mature witnessing state. It's the state which is characterized by full awakening of the self within one's Atma. Yet it stands in opposition to the world of experience. In other words, one claimed one's self. The self is being reclaimed. The experience of that self is undoubtedly there at all times. And one witnesses everything. One witnesses conversations, feelings, thoughts, sensations of one's own body, thoughts as they come and go, situations. In other words, one is in a fully mature witnessing state. One now is that witness. The self identifies with that witness. You see? So this is the characteristics of the cosmic state of consciousness. Then, when there is a certain propensity, and we can speak about it in brief, with the dawn of the cosmic state of consciousness, the interesting process begins to take place. The process known as refinement of perception. That refinement of perception is when we begin to perceive the finer aspects in reality that prior to that were not available to the field of our perception. In other words, the same setting, the same light, the same day, the same room, the same situation, the same characters. But we were only perceiving it, perhaps if we use that, at the face value and finer aspects of that were not open to the field of our perception. And yet something begins to change. It's as if the windows of our perception have been cleared. Prior to that, everything was as it is, but it's as if the windows were tinted, maybe from all the, like that rain, that dust, that what have you. They still give in light. You can still, obviously, not stumbling in the dark anymore. But it's as if someone removed that film, removed that veil, and everything comes in much crispier, crystal light. Every situation, every sense perception begins to be lit with this extra, and at some point, extraordinary light. This is spoken of as the dawn of God consciousness, else referred to as celestial perception. So refinement of perception leads to celestial perception. What happens behind the scenes? Yogic philosophy, in all its systems, speaks about the templates of creation. All that, what holds creation, as it were, at the state of blueprint. So all this is spoken in terms of tattvas, categories of consciousness. In classical Indian philosophy there are 24, in Kashmir Shaivism there are 36, but both overlap a lot, particularly when it comes to the creation and order within the creation, where we have all these templates that are at the very source of grand elements, the 5 great grand elements, the Mahabhutas, and how that in turn gives birth to all the sense perception in a state of its potentiality, all the indriyas and karmindriyas, and all that eventually down to the physical creation, where that order of the Mahabhutas, grand elements, are now expressed fully at the level of air, water, fire, and so forth. So this physical realm exists at the level of templates. Not only that, not only the physical realm of, let's say, what we refer to as the physical world, but that also includes all the subtle emotional states that we experience without exception. All are there in a form of templates. So these templates, as it were, completely hidden, obviously, from view. There is no access to them. All we have is this, what is referred to as this matrix of experience. We are at the receiving end of that experience. And this receiving end of that experience is always at the mercy of the sensory perception, and how that in turn is interpreted by the mental faculties. And if nothing is cross-wired somewhere, then all this remains intact. So everyone will enjoy the scent of the rose because it's simply beautiful. Everyone will have an expansive feeling when exposed to the orange and yellow color, and ever so contracting feelings when exposed to deep purple, depending on which lion that is. So, stay focused. I'm talking to myself. So, all colors are functioning here in response, in correspondence to that, how we are programmed, wired to respond to this certain stimuli. So, this, in the process of refinement of perception, what happens is that our awareness, if we speak about it, individualized awareness, begins to get expanded, and we gain access, or our consciousness gains access to this hidden strata. And these templates begin to be, as it were, detected, even if not in terms of closing your eyes and knowing where all that taking place, but simply subtlest touch to that level immediately corresponds to that refinement at the level of physical perception. This is what is experienced repeatedly when you come out of deep absorption, when your meditation was deep enough, when your sleep was deep enough, when your rest was deep enough. You come out and everything is shade brighter, somehow renewed. No redecoration took place in the house. It feels crispier. Every thought feels more harmonious. Every cognition feels more orchestrated. And there is the sense of coherence. There's a sense of coherence. Things not happen randomly, independent from each other. You feel a kind of wave upon wave. You could feel that there is a rhythm in what you do, in how everything sits together. This is the dawn of refinement, of perception, which leads to celestial perception, else spoken of as God consciousness. In God consciousness, that gap between the self and the world begins to get reduced. If in cosmic state of consciousness, in witnessing state of consciousness, that gap can be quite acutely experienced. I've many times pointed out that if it is not accompanied by bliss, if it's not accompanied by Ananda, as in some cases it can be experienced as a clinical witnessing, then one will run dry very soon. At first, witnessing state of consciousness brings about spontaneous detachment, that coveted state of dispassion, vairagya, which is impossible to achieve just by understanding. No matter how much we read about vairagya, no matter how much we read about how good it is to be detached, to be dispassionate from the events, circumstances, it has its way. Why? Because it has its way in the very instrumentality of how it functions. Mind clings to the outcome of the events, and it cannot have it any other way, because it functions at that level of frequency. And in the witnessing state, with the dawn of witnessing state of consciousness, suddenly the space is created. And space is enough to feel the self as uninvolved from activity. So when the self is being experienced as uninvolved from activity, it is accompanied by spontaneous dispassion. So vairagya is granted. So from that point of view, it's a lofty achievement. We say, with regard to this, that when analogy is given, how far one should go. Let's say you give the landscape as a walking mountains. How far one should go before camping. That's the place one can camp. Until you reach witnessing state of consciousness, keep going. Too early to camp, because our awareness, our attention will be arrested. All that territory gained, we might just go in a loop somewhere. So camping, this is the place where we can actually now we can camp. We can camp because at this base camp, we can summit the consciousness based on what will be spoken in a moment. But if the witnessing state of consciousness is not accompanied by Ananda, then sooner or later it begins to feel as a very dry affair. Relationships crumble often. One is unable to relate because one remains constant witness. I will give you an example. In a witnessing state of consciousness, you're holding your baby and you're completely detached from the baby. You want to connect to the baby, but there is a gap between you as the witness. Your dearest and nearest, in a moment of that oxytocin supposedly releasing hug and clinging to you, because the maximum oxytocin release is happening after its first minute, you're not feeling anything. Okay? Mouth-to-mouth kiss. All right, let oxytocin flow, but I'm not engaged. So this is how dry witnessing is experienced, and people get tired from it. If you land on a teaching or teacher that themselves teach from the place of witnessing, and this is very, very often, very common. You'd be surprised how common that is. You might get a pat on your shoulder that's all there is, pal. Okay? Relax and don't worry about anything else. You thought enlightenment is a big deal? No, that's all there is. You are the witness, eternal witness. You are now separated yourself from the world. So, your meditation cushion can go into eBay, and well, apparently that's not so. So this is why this very helpful delineation gives us clarity on the degrees and qualities within Turiyatita. So the God consciousness is where that gap begins to get more and more illumined within. So it's not longer remains to be a clean-cut, distant like that separates the self from the field of activity. Literally. The self from the field of activity. Atma, Dharma. Then, if there is a propensity which is began to get literally oiled by the rise of heart-based qualities, because it's all connected now, because the heart here begins to generate the most powerful vibrations. Mind is of no use there at all. We leave the mind behind. Reasons for that will be explained further. If you want, we can talk about this. Why mind no longer of much use in the development of the higher states of consciousness. This is very important to understand. Your body has more importance in the development of a higher states of consciousness than your mind. Paradoxically as it sounds, it is to be experienced. So, what happens in the progression from the God consciousness to unity consciousness is that the gap between the self and the field of activity begins to get obliterated. What is the gap? What is this that makes the witnessing and keeps that witnessing in check? It's that coveted relationship between subject and object. Subject now reclaimed. Subject now is in driving seat. But the objective sphere of experience remains to be separate from the subject. In witnessing, it is acutely experienced. You see? It's like forcefully almost, forcibly separated by that power. It is required as well. You can't, in most cases, leapfrog into unity. It's nearly impossible. So this is, if we speak about it, definitely a stagely process. what happens is that with the refinement of perception, with the celestial perception, when we are able to evaluate the finer aspects in our experiences, with that, something begins to happen, or something extraordinary begins to happen. Subject begins to recognize itself in the object more and more and more frequently. And that recognition is accompanied by the softening first of the edges. When the softening of the edges takes place, subject no longer defined by that what is characterizing witnessing state of consciousness. It is, as it were, more willing to make that focus less crisp. You see, Rumi used to say, if you see too sharply, squint your eyes. This is like one of the lines from his verse. So, eventually, with the rise of that and maturity of that celestial perception, there is so much light that that gap that separated the subject and object illumines both to such degree that it eliminates subject and object altogether. That is the state of unity. In unity, subject and object annihilate each other. One does not experience objective phenomena as if the objective phenomena taking place outside of oneself. You can reflect on that. There's no harm. It's very, very helpful, very, very useful. We all have glimpses of the state of unity in a variety of ways. When mother looks at her child, the love that swells her heart unites the subject and object in that moment of experience. When artist, poet, composer, musician at work, at some point, that phenomenal activity temporarily leads to the cessation of the acuity of the experience of subject and object. Moreover, it can take place to a remote spectator, someone who is in the opera, rock concert, or in front of the painting, in front of the landscape, something which took our attention to such degree that our attention arrests all other activity. All other activity becomes subordinate. All of us have experienced this at some point in time. This is when we are granted, as it were. These are simply glimpses of the state of unity. You are alone, there's no need for conversation, there is no need to ascertain this, and you're in front of the profound display of nature. You become one with that experience. The mind made idle. Glimpses of unity. You're sitting down there and drawing that jug, that flower, as a student. You're drawing it. You're looking there on your paper. You're looking there on your paper. You're looking there on your paper. 1,000 times this contact back and forth. At some point, you become one with that, what you're looking at and what you're drawing. This is the glimpse of state of unity. Glimpse. No, it's not permanent, of course, but it's a glimpse. So this is how we all know unity and granted that experience. But in spiritual terms, in terms of the transformation of consciousness, it's literally when subject and object undergo such intimate encounter that whatever one experiences it only as a reflection of one's own self. One doesn't fail to know and recognize that this is you in space-time, and I'm witnessing, experiencing this, but at the very same time, that experience is not taking place in spatial convention. It is experienced here in the heart of the apparent perceiver. So this is not to confuse and make state of unity as unachievable that one cannot function, because one can come across these propositions that when the state of unity is experienced, it incapacitates one. Maybe at first, because of utter and sheer novelty of that, when that hasn't been the case, it may lead to a state of certain arrest. Maybe it requires a state of integration. Just as any experience of the kind, as an actor in a role on a stage, giving it all, absolutely all, with such degree of identification with the role, that when they come out of the stage, they need time. They need time to leave the role behind. And we know that in method acting, right, the system developed by Stanislavski and adopted by many early Hollywood, not many actually, few Hollywood actors, for which it has gained its popularity. I've heard about this, no? Method acting. Marlon Brando was a fine example of that in the early years. And closer to our time, we could argue some very, very fine actors who have been employing that. Robert De Niro, Daniel Day-Lewis comes to mind as a master of that, who also paid price for each roles, because he, in the interviews, spoke how difficult it is for him to come out of the role months after the end of, let's say, a project. And it is also very well known that method actors prefer to remain in the role during the filming, even in the moments between the shooting, because it's not something they can enter in and out. For example, just like to extend this to the degree that my left foot, where I think won the first Oscar for Daniel Day-Lewis when he played someone with cerebral palsy who can only eat by using one of his foot, left foot. Who watched this film? He's in wheelchair. Remember that film? Yeah, exactly. Even between the shots, he insisted to take his meals the way that his character plays in the movie, to the astonishment of the crew. When he was preparing for the role of the Last of the Mohican, he spent purportedly 6 months in the wilderness of where the film will take place, by himself entirely, camping in a tent, in a sleeping bag. So this coming out of requires a phase of integration. So yes, unity consciousness can feel as an overwhelming experience, particularly because it is characterized by lack of any boundaries. Do you understand what it means? You can imagine what it means. Lack of any boundaries. These boundaries are all submerged. So in other words, speaking about it clinically, one's ahamkaric field that here functions to safeguard, ascertain, define one's individual boundaries are now extended to the furthest corners of the universe. So one's ahamkara is now everywhere. So this, of course, can feel very, very disorienting at first. But it is not true to say, let alone insist, that it is impossible to function, because with the integration, the return of that ahamkara to simply function at the level of locality, which is required, keeps within itself the very, very aspect of whatever is experienced not as out there. It's as simple as that. It's experienced always as one's reality. I will tell you more. You all know that if you have ever felt very strongly in love with someone or something. When an object of our love continuously burns in our heart. Who have experienced this? True lovers in the room? Great to know. Particularly when this is when we grow up and we fall in love, there is no time when we don't even need to think about the one we love. It's in the heart here. It burns. It feels like it's aching, it burns. It's not like, that girl, I love her, yeah. Okay, what's up, man? Let's get on. No, it's constant. This is exactly how it feels in a state of unity, because love is unity. The greatest experience of unity reconfirms the essence of love, and vice versa. So not only we get glimpse of unity when we experience this and that during the phenomenal activity, but actually the experience of love, it's a kind of gift, a grace available. Of course, in quite a short time, it all gets quite convoluted, because the mind begins to enter and create havoc. Because then, of course, we enter the realm of confusing the love that is experienced here by the propensity to project that love onto an object of our experience, which then robs us of that experience itself, because it is traded there and then for the object upon which that wave of love is now projected. And therefore, unless we get that object, we are heartbroken. See? This is very, very freeing realization. Therefore, they say that unrequited love, it's the shortcut to God. This is in Sufi, this is in Neoplatonism, this is in Plotinus. Unrequited love. You want to experience God? You want to experience your divinity? Well, get the refutal. Learn what it means to be denied. Granted. Voila. So, not so much time left for the thing, so we have to take just a little bit into lunch, okay? So at least we can link now this background, right? The kind of back to basics with what we have spoken yesterday, and it's very important. Let's not feel that somehow it was a missed opportunity to forward our topic, our theme. So with this, you will understand that the difference between Turiya and Turiyatita with regard to the Samavesha, it is the individual who penetrates into the state of Turiya. You see? It's individual consciousness that experiences penetration into Turiya. But everything higher than Turiya, everything finer than Turiya, it's the other way around. So when it comes to Turiyatita, it is the higher state of consciousness that penetrates individual awareness, and that's where the process of fusion begins. This is the most interesting alchemical churning, where individuality begins to get churned so as to arrive at the so that to arrive at the product of what this individuality in essence is. An individual is universal. So this canonical, iconic, right? Atman is Brahman, or Jiva is Shiva, and so forth. That's what it meant to represent. But from the behind the scenes, in terms of the alchemy of the process, this is what takes place. The penetration into the transcendent is only at the level of individual. Individual consciousness performs that. And then the higher penetration takes place when the higher states of consciousness, as it were, penetrate that what is no longer just individual consciousness, because it's already knows what transcendent is. This is why we have had that on the far right bottom corner. Remember? So this is where that fusion begins to take place.